Good evening and welcome, everybody. And thank you for joining us for this discussion sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Allan Motenko. I'm here today with award-winning journalist John Miller. Before we get to questions, let me give you a little bit of background about Mr. Miller. He is currently CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst based in New York City. He joined the network in 2022 and provides reporting and analysis on national security, counterterrorism, intelligence, and law enforcement matters. Before CNN, Mr. Miller served as the NYPD's Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism and held senior roles at the LAPD, FBI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He was also a veteran journalist and was reported for ABC News, CBS News, and WNBC. Mr. Miller, thank you for being with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start, as they say, at the beginning. Which in your case is the fact that your dad was you're a second generation journalist. Your dad was a syndicated columnist and writer, and I heard you describe once in a story that your family home in Montclair was like a press mill. What was that like growing up with your dad as a famous journalist?
Well, he was one of the original work from home, newspaper men. He had worked in an office in the city, and when we moved to New Jersey, his office in the house just became this factory. I mean, it was piled with newspapers. All the papers got delivered every day, including out-of-town papers that would come in the next day. And he would be working three phones, and there would be spikes for items about this kind of stuff and spikes for items about that kind of stuff. And he was writing at one point 7 different columns under 6 different names. He was Nigel, somebody from London, and Pierre, somebody from Paris, and Sergio, someone from Rome, and he was John J. Miller from New York, who wrote the Broadway gossip columnist. But he also had a John Relum, which apparently was Miller spelled backwards, where he put the second string items that he wasn't sure about. So running around with him, across New York City meant, the Copacabana, nightclubs, Broadway, all kinds of Damon Runyon characters, from the Walter Winchell age of journalism, cops, robbers, gangsters. So it was a odd and yet very entertaining childhood. But he taught me the core talents of getting the story right, getting the story out. And it looked like a job that came with a front row seat to the greatest show on earth, which is the unfolding news.
And did he want you to follow in his footsteps, or did you just bitten by the bug?
Well, I was bitten by the bug, and I also love the crime stories. So I suppose if I could have become a detective, I might have pursued a different path. But I didn't want to wait. So, as he kind of carried me around with him, I started bringing a camera and taking pictures and selling those to the newspapers. And then I met some of the TV reporters, and occasionally I would call them with a tip, something I picked up on the police radio, or from one of my dad's friends. And one of them, I think literally because he got tired of me calling him, said, "Let's just get you a job in the newsroom. You can sit here and listen to our police radios, take messages for the assignment editor on the desk, and whatever stories you get, tell that guy." So I started work there, and in the first couple of weeks there, and bear in mind at this point, I was, I think, 14 years old. It was 1973. I was about to turn 15, but either way, I was in the 9th grade in Montclair High School, and there was a building collapse in Queens, and I remember saying to my dad, "Stop the car. I have to call the news desk and make sure they didn't miss it because it's a Sunday night and they're short-staffed." And no, they knew about it. And the guy who answered the phone, apparently he answered all the phones at once, put everybody on hold, and told the guy from the lab, "Get back here." Told the camera crew at the Garden, "Get out to Queens." Told one of the people, "Get back and start writing." And then he picked up the phone where I was, fully believing that it was a veteran radio reporter from our sister station, and said, "We don't have any reporters, so get out there and cover the story. The camera crew's on the way." And I remember getting into the car and telling my dad, "We better hurry because they just assigned me to cover the story for the 10 o'clock news." And when I got back, we ran the film up from the lab, and I ran up to the anchor man. He's the guy who had answered the phone. The guy on the desk had long gone. And he said, "Well, what's his name?" I'm like, "Who?" He said, "The guy I sent to cover the story." And I'm like, "No, that was me." He said, "Who the hell are you?" I said, I work here after school during the week." He said, "Who the hell told you you could cover the story?" I'm like, "Well, that was you." So anyway, they put the story on because it was the lead story with the building collapse, the 3 dead, the injuries. And the following Monday, the next day, um, a small inquiry was carried out by the news director and vice president to determine how it came to pass exactly that a ninth grader from New Jersey had covered the lead story on the news. But from there, what do they say? It's all history, right?
Well, that or fake it till you make it, or both.
Yeah, no, definitely both.
Now you were there through high school, right?
Yeah,
They
so
they obviously the investigation didn't go poorly.
no, no, I mean, actually, you point out, the one question nobody ever asked about that story, which is, well, who got in trouble for this? And the answer was no one. The news director, who was a guy named Ted Kavanaugh, who was a bit of a character unto himself, said, "Well, I don't care. You know, if we couldn't find anybody and we got a kid from New Jersey who managed to get out there and get back with the film, at least if we run short at night, we know there's a guy we can depend on." So that actually happened. When they ran out of reporters as it got closer to airtime, if something happened, I'd go out with the camera crew, and I wasn't doing live shots. These were the wood burning cameras from the steam engine newsrooms. I mean, we didn't have live shots, but I would ask the questions and hold the microphone and make the notes and come back and help with the film, and I was learning in the field.
And so you did that through high school. And how hard was it for you to say, okay, I'm gonna not only go to college, but leave New York and come to the arch rival city of Boston and go to Emerson?
So it was hard enough. I mean, because I thought, when I turned 18 and they gave me my, police department press card and said, "All right, you're now the weekend reporter and you can work on the desk during the week." I thought that was the greatest thing ever. But a couple of years into it, as I turned 20, I realized that, if you were going to be a person of substance, most people had been to college. And, I talked to them about it and they said, "We'll support you through that." So they said you could stay on as the weekend reporter and, see what schools you get into. And I got into Emerson College in Boston, and started going there. And I took, Mass Comm 101. And then I would, I mean, I never told the kids in the dorm where I was going. I just said I had to go home on the weekends, which nobody did. And then I'd cover the news. And then one weekend after the Christmas break, I came back and my roommate said, "I know who you I know who you are now." And I'm like, "Who?" He said, "I saw you on the news while I was home." And I'm like, "Huh. Well, let's just keep that between us." So I made it, through about a year of that before I literally ran out of money, and then went back to work. So I got the college experience, if not the degree.
You went to the school of hard knocks, and it clearly it's paid off, so it's okay. I have to just ask before I move on to the journalism stuff, any memorable Boston experiences, favorite haunts?
So
Uh,
my memorable Boston experience was I got there in the blizzard of 78.
oh, perfect.
So there was literally 5 feet of snow piled up on every street. So you could walk down the street, go to class, cross the street only by finding the holes that had been
Yeah.
cut, various openings of the snow, and everything was frozen. And it was like that for weeks because even after it stopped snowing, it didn't get any warmer. So it was a lesson in New England winters. The other thing I remember was, I lived in the dorm at 100 Beacon Street, and there was a place across the street, and I would like take my reading and something to write on to make notes from the textbooks before like doing the homework. So I'd take them over there and I'd get a beer, maybe some French fries, and I would do the reading and drink the beer and then go back to the dorm. And this was a place called the Bull and Finch, which, a couple of
Hmm.
Emerson students had done the same thing I had, except through 4 years of college, and had become regulars there. So they wrote a treatment for a show called Cheers,
Oh,
and the rest, as they say, really is history.
so that's not in your bio, but that's a pretty great story.
And while it was some smarter Emerson guys got there before
Yeah.
me,
Hey,
but they turned it into a big success.
that's good. That's a
And
cool.
I
That's a
mean,
cool.
the Bull and Finch they didn't need a cue. I mean, once the show hit, they changed the name to Cheers and started selling merch.
Yeah, absolutely. So you got the Boston experience. You made connections with some friends who knew how to create a good TV show. You got to keep your job on the news, and then you went back to New York and just kind of picked up where you left off.
Pretty much, I mean, during my Boston times, I covered the Boston Marathon for the New York stations. When the American team came back from the Olympics, the hockey team that beat the Russians, I covered their arrival there. I had the advantage of being, Channel 5 News's, New York station. I got the advantage of also being their only Boston correspondent during that time, which was just a different way to learn the town, covering stories up there, and met the local crews, and some of the cops that I did ride-alongs with, to kind of learn my way around town. And they were all talking about this, hotshot lieutenant named Bill Bratton, who I would later cross paths with. Destiny would take a hand.
We're going to get there in a second. I do have a number of Bratton questions. Before we get there, let's stay on the other side of the law for a moment. I have to ask you about, because amidst a bevy of things that make you extraordinary, uh, your godmother, I believe, was the wife of the Luciano crime family's godfather,
So
right?
my godmother was the wife of the boss of all bosses and the chairman of the mob's commission, Frank Costello.
Okay, just an average day in New York, sure.
Sure. Listen, I mean, I've got pictures of the christening, and I think so does the FBI. But that was, kind of an extension of my father's strange world of, like the Swiss Red Cross, traveling with neutrality between cops, robbers, and showbiz people. It was one of those people he knew from the Copa.
And now mixing with folks of that background as early as you did in your life, did it impact your reporting? Did it impact your career in police work? Or is it just a sort of part of your family life that is just sort of an anecdote?
Well, I mean, I was a little kid and I didn't actually know who these guys were, but I knew they were different. They all drove big Cadillacs and Lincolns. They all had big diamond pinky rings. They never got dressed up in a suit and tie.
Mhm.
They never seemed to have to go to an office. And, these were one segment of my father's friends who, when you went to their houses and they had a party or a gathering on the weekend, they had these fabulous spreads of food, and, these big swimming pools, and, a lot of family came around, and, it became a feature, but they all had different names. There was, Angelo the Jet, Tom Terrific, um, you know, uh, everybody seemed to have a nickname. I don't know if I ever really got to know everybody's last name, but I remember being a young TV reporter on the night shift, and there was a bombing in Queens, off the Grand Central Parkway, and I remember getting there with the camera crew, and it was in a cemetery, and somebody had blown up a mausoleum, and the brass doors had been blown open, and I looked up on the sign and it said Costello. And I'm like, Costello? So I said to one of the cops, what Costello is this? He said, Frank Costello, the mob boss.
Mm.
And I remember stopping at a payphone on the way home and calling my father and said, Dad, somebody blew up Uncle Frank's tomb. Like, what's that about?
Yeah.
And he said, it's a message. It must mean there's a new boss in town and the old dons are dead, the old bets are off. And it was a signal. And it turns out it was from the new boss was a guy named Carmine Galenti. I would later cover his murder, which was a famous crime scene. But it was just one of those intersections where the things I barely understood from my childhood, that crowd, um, and my godfather kind of crossed with my night job, which was covering crime.
And did that lend you to, so in addition to the Valenti murder, the other mob boss, I think you're probably somewhat well known for his interactions with John Gotti. I know I heard you say in another interview you did that you had the idea to surround him with more cameras and cameramen than comprised his
His
security.
detail.
Yeah, and I heard that and I said, well, what gave him that idea? Now, was that just a journalistic trick, or was that sort of like, hey, I grew up around you people. I'm not gonna take being pushed over as a strategy to avoid the press.
Well, it was both. And actually, the idea came from Geraldo Rivera,
Huh, okay.
although he doesn't know that. I was watching a Geraldo Rivera special on the mafia, and I saw him try to approach John Gotti, wearing a wireless microphone with a camera in a hidden van across the street to, have a conversation with him. And I saw the two bodyguards moved up and intercepted him. Gotti fell back and went the other way. And it occurred to me every time we walked up with a camera crew, we ended up tangling with people, and people ended up on the ground and all that stuff. And Gotti always seemed to disappear, and I'm like, wait a minute, I just saw it from a distance. It's a football play. It's a normal play. So the two blockers move up, the quarterback drops back, he fades left, and by the time everybody gets off the ground, he's gone with the ball.
Hmm.
So I said, what we need to do is we need to have people coming from behind and from the side.
Back to box.
Right, exactly. So we got three camera crews. I wanted four, but the cameraman had gone sick from one of them, but they had the lighting guy. So I said, we'll take the lighting guy because he held an additional light up. And if you've got two bodyguards and four crews, if this bodyguard puts his hand over that lens and that bodyguard puts his hand over that lens, there's still two lenses that are going to be unaffected. So we did that and basically followed John Gotti for a block and got what passed for an interview. A lot of it was him saying, "Why are you doing this? I've always treated you like a gentleman," and saying different things. But it had the effect because after that, and the cameras faded away, he said, "What was that about?" And I said, "Your people push my people around. It gets very uncomfortable. So whenever we do this, we're just going to bring a lot of people." And he said, don't ever do that again. My people will never touch your people. And, you ask your question and then go away. So after that, we never had to do that again. His people never pushed my people around. I'd ask a couple of questions. He'd give a couple of answers. It, it had this weird effect, though, because when we did that and the films played, you'd run into people in restaurants or places and they're like, hey, you're the guy who covers John Gotti. You and him just walk around talking all the time. I mean, they thought we just hung out together, which wasn't the case. But, he was one of those figures that captured the imagination of New York and a national audience because unlike these other gangsters who pretended to be something else, he looked like the gangsters in the movies,
Mhm.
life imitating art.
I'm stuck a little bit on the what we call in Yiddish the chutzpah of what you did, because clearly it merited his respect, but you're not Geraldo, right? You're far more reserved and respectful, whatever word you want to use. But what gave you that? What gave you that chutzpah, or was it just simply you saw the football play, you had to act on it, and it really wasn't a broader reflection of anything, or was it sort of just a confidence that you think you brought to the conversation?
Well, I think it was that. And I mean it had a specific purpose. We were doing an hour-long documentary on Gotti,
Hmm.
and the only footage I had from him where we asked him the question, are you the boss of the Gambino crime family? Did you murder the boss before all these, there was like two or three questions that needed to be asked. Um, and I wanted to get them asked without just a lot of footage of the camera going up in the air and wires crossing. So I thought that was a strategy, but it turns out um, the the fast break and the surround strategy actually brokered a way to ask those questions anytime. And while the answers um, that he gave weren't particularly substantive, um, not any more or less than most politicians in some cases, but um, it did stop the physicality between members of the Gambino crime family and members of WNBC TV, which I think
Mm,
was a good thing.
yeah, absolutely. So fast forward a little bit, you have this ability to break through to Gotti, but then you're also very much involved in sort of his undoing with reporting on the bribe around the bribe he ended up giving to the juror. Or how did that all come about, and what do you remember from that whole episode?
Well, Gotti was one of those stories that went on for, I mean, basically 7 years. Some of it he was in jail for. He'd get out on bail again, but you know, I think because he was such a fascination to people. And remember, this is at a time when organized crime controlled um, almost every facet of life in New York. And when I say that, you didn't always feel it, but when you sat down at a restaurant, the fish came from the Fulton Fish Market, which was run by organized crime. Nothing got through there without them making money on it, which meant you paid more for that fish. If you went to the convention center, they controlled the laborers and the hiring. And, if you went to a convention in New York, the mob was getting a piece of that. If you
Hmm.
built a building, they had the steel, the concrete, the painters, the carpenters. So it was it was at a time when organized crime had basically situated itself across so many industries, and they were beginning to be a real focus of the federal government. So it was worth reporting on. And then you had this charismatic boss who was like a moth to the flame. He seemed to enjoy the publicity, but then there's the flame part, which is he garnered so much attention that people in Washington said this guy has to be taken down. And one trial, two trials, three trials, and as you point out, did a lot of reporting on cases that were fixed, jurors that were paid off. Um, and then, I mean, one of the biggest stories was his right hand trusted, aide, Sammy Gravano, flipped and became, a cooperating witness with the government. And, I broke that story that night. And, it was a real shock, not just to the public who followed the Gotti case closely, but to the whole mob, which is, that was a time back when, and things have changed since, but when underbosses of crime families weren't becoming cooperating witnesses.
Hmm. So you get through the Gotti experience, and now you decide, okay, that guy Bill Bratton, he becomes the police commissioner in New York. You said if maybe you had a different upbringing at the age of 3, you might have become a police detective. You now go to the NYPD, you become a public information officer. And I can imagine some of the allure there was just, I wonder what this is like, right? Certainly, if you grow up wanting to be a cop at a certain point, you say, oh, maybe I have a chance to actually do this. But what'd you learn from it? What did it meet your expectations? How did it go?
So I learned a lot from it. You know, the I mean, you hit the nail on the head. My real desire was, as a crime reporter, in some measure, you have your nose pressed up against the same piece of glass and you're looking through it. You can see it better than most people, but you're never really on the other side. I wanted to know, what was it like on the other side of that yellow tape where you didn't have to call people and, try to convince them to give you the information to become, a good source? What happens if you just showed up and everybody told you everything because it was part of your job?
Yeah.
And, my reaction literally the first day at work is, my lieutenant took me into the office and he said, here's your desk. These are the morning reports. And I started going through the chief of detectives confidential log and the chief of department's confidential log. And then, the other confidential log. And I remember flipping through them and saying, oh my God, these are like fantastic stories. And then my second thought is, oh my God, what if they get out? And then I'm like, what has happened to you? Um, so there was some of that, but the other part of it was just, you know, Bill Bratton was, kind of the opposite of John Gotti,
Mhm.
also a charismatic leader, and a guy who enjoyed the limelight, but a guy who decided, we could reduce crime in New York, who believed we could do it in a way that no one else had ever done it before, and that we could change life in the city to be safer and better. And he had a plan. And I was really fascinated as a guy who had covered crime at that point for 20 years, thinking, well, what will that be like? What does that plan look like? What does it sound like? Will it work? And to get to join that effort and kind of ride along with Bratton and his crime strategist, the brilliant lieutenant turned deputy commissioner Jack Maple, um, when I came out the other side of that, um, I wasn't a bad public information officer for the press, but I left it a much better reporter because I now understood things that I would have never learned on the outside.
Was it during that tenure, or was it a subsequent position where you sort of started to feel like, okay, I'm not just a reporter, I'm actually a cop?
Um, well, the world of policing is very seductive. When you get on the other side of that yellow tape, there's a real camaraderie, brotherhood, sisterhood, and the stakes are immeasurably high because now it's not just about getting the story right, getting the story first. Now it has tinges of life and death, and not just telling the stories of life and death, but affecting life and death. So it had an intensity that was an allure unto itself, and yet, more than the allure, when your feet hit that cold wooden floor getting out of bed in the morning, you never had to wonder like, what am I going to work for? It had a real sense of purpose. So in that way, it was, I'm going to use the word addictive. Um, I think after, Bratton's contretemps with Mayor Giuliani
Mhm.
and my abrupt departure and then his abrupt departure, um, not because we were doing a bad job. I think we were doing a great job, but I think the mayor was irked by the idea that Bratton was getting a lot of credit for things that Giuliani thought he should get credit for. I went back to journalism and, I had had some um, hard lessons on how to deal with the press, hard lessons on the reality of politics, um, but real up close lessons about crime fighting, and cities. So it was, for the time I was there, it was the kind of fellowship you couldn't have gotten at Harvard.
Now, was it that sort of high stakes, this is all really important, I want to be doing work that's at the sort of tip of the spear that led you to Osama bin Laden, or was it something else?
You know, it's funny. It was a mix of both. So I've left the police department. While I was in the police department, the bombing of the World Trade Center had happened just
Mhm.
before I had gotten there with Bratton. So, the NYPD and FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force was out there capturing these guys in Africa, you know, all over the world, in the Middle East, one at a time. And one of them, Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of the World Trade Center bombing, um, and a couple of the other suspects, they'd all fought in Afghanistan against the Russians. And, this name, Osama bin Laden, kept echoing in the background of those cases. So by the time I was at ABC News in 1997, going into 98, um, the name was echoing again. And I met with a source who said, this guy bin Laden, he's behind the World Trade Center bombing. He paid for it. He's behind the plot to blow up airliners over the Pacific. He had a plot to kill President Clinton in Manila. They had plans to murder the Pope. And I'm thinking, who is this guy? I mean, we wondered back in the old days whether he was just a money guy, if he had operational aspirations. But now that it seems like he's a global terrorist leader, and there's not three people in America who have ever heard of him outside of the FBI or CIA. So, with the team at ABC News, the question became, is he findable? Is he interviewable? And that started that quest.
Now, I heard you say earlier that you went to that first Gotti interview with sort of very specific questions you knew you wanted to get out. I've also heard you say that you went to the bin Laden interview with very specific questions you wanted to get out. As a journalist, was that something you sort of was that a strategy, or was that just happenstance with these sort of two big people that you were sort of hell bent on? These are the questions I want to make sure I ask, and whatever else I can get out is extra, or was that just how you approach the work? Or
Well, in the bin Laden case, with Gotti, it was easy. Are you the boss of the family? Did you kill Castellano? So on.
yeah,
Um, in the bin Laden case, I wanted to know, did you bomb the World Trade Center? Did you know Ramzi Youssef? I knew who some of the witnesses were in the upcoming case. Did you know this one or that one? Because I thought it would be interesting if he admitted associations with the people that we knew carried out the bombings and some of these other plots. But complicated because Ayman al-Zawahiri, his number two, would come to the place where we were being held in this camp, after kind of I don't know, like a 7-day trip across, South Asia to get to Afghanistan. Um, and he said, well, what are the questions you're going to ask? And I said, we generally don't give questions before an interview. It's spontaneous, but I mean, the stuff you'd expect. And he said, no, we need the questions because you're going to ask them in English, and we have a translator who's going to repeat them. But our translator is not like from the UN or the State Department. His English is okay. But if you write them out, we can translate them into writing. And then when you ask that question, he will translate it in the exact words you ask it in. So I took out a pad and I said, you come from a rich family. Why would somebody in your position fight on the front lines of Afghanistan if you didn't have to? Trying to start slowly and kind of round out the personality. Do you have a message for America? Did you, finance the bombing of the World Trade Center? Did you know Ramzi Youssef? Did you know this one and that one? Uh, and I came up with about 16 questions. Did you plot to blow up the airliners over the Pacific? Did you plan to kill the Pope? Uh, and and then when I got there, they said, he's going to answer all of your questions. So I went through them, and his answers were, what's your message for America? I declare war on America, and this war will begin very soon, and it'll be greater than our war with the Russians. And the key phrase was, this is not just those in the military uniform. Civilians will be a target of this fatwa or religious decree as well. And, the story we left with was bin Laden declares war on America.
now you couldn't ask, as Adam points out in the chat, you couldn't ask follow-up questions, right?
Well, no, because they said, we're not going to translate his answers to you. So I was sitting there and he was looking at the translator. So, to make sure I didn't have an hour-long interview with a guy looking over here, I made eye contact with him and started nodding, so that he would focus on me.
Hmm.
And, we did that for an hour as I went through the rest of the questions. And I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know if he was thinking, okay, this guy understands some Arabic because now he seems to be talking to me, or if he just thought, I guess he wants me to look over here. But I stayed focused and nodding and maintained eye contact. And at the end, I went back to the translator and I said, what happened? And he said, the Americans are the worst terrorists in the world. He's declaring war, and, it's going to cause the destruction of the United States and, the collapse of democracy. And I said, well, what was I doing? And he said, you were nodding in agreement for most of the time.
Hmm.
It was certainly unintended.
Yeah.
But at that point, I knew, you know what? Let's not worry about that. Let's get the tapes and get out.
And now, did you get any scrutiny from your friends in law enforcement about that interview? And did people want to question you about your experience, or was you sort of left alone and the interview sort of spoke for itself?
So, yes and no. I knew that when we came back with the interview, because part of my story was there's a federal grand jury investigation into bin Laden, and he's going to be indicted for blowing up the World Trade Center,
Hmm.
was that this video was going to end up being subpoenaed by the grand jury, outtakes and all. And I went to Shelby Coffey, who was the executive vice president at ABC News under Roone Arledge and David Weston, and said, we're going to get the subpoena, and it's not just going to be what we put on the air. They're going to want it all. What do we do? Because it was one of those awkward situations where you didn't know, which side of that issue to be on, but we did have standards and practices, which is we didn't turn over outtakes.
Hmm.
And he said, well, that's easy. Is the interview interesting? I said, the whole damn thing is fascinating. He said, we're going to post the whole thing on our website verbatim, and then there won't be any outtakes, you know. And if they give us a subpoena, we'll tell them, here's the transcript. If you want the tape that goes with it, write it in. And that's what happened. The subpoena came. We had the entire transcript. And, in the great law of unintended consequences, when the government and the defense couldn't agree on a transcript, the judge said, we'll use the ABC News transcript.
Oh, okay. Um, Before I get back to your work in policing, 9/11 happens. Uh, you clearly, I don't want to say, you clearly understood what bin Laden was saying, right? That he was looking at more than just an armed conflict with the military, which I assume sort of allowed you to have a unique insight into the work around 9/11. Can you just talk about your journalism experience during that time and um, what you remember about reporting during that period?
Yeah. So I remember that the big story of the day was that a hair had been found inside a car connected to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, and that with new DNA technology, they might identify, who was the driver of the car they believe, kidnapped him. Um, that was until the planes hit. I got to tell you, I went from ABC News to the LAPD to the FBI to the DNI, and worked in every intelligence job in Washington. I couldn't tell you who that hair traced back to or what the results of the DNA were because, at 8:45 that morning,
Everything changed.
all those other stories stopped mattering.
Hmm.
Um, I was leaving Good Morning America when the planes hit, made a quick right turn and went up to the ABC studios. When the second plane hit, I was passing the control room. And when the second plane hit, all of the questions I was going to be bringing to that live shot with Peter Jennings had been resolved, which is how could a plane on a cloudless day in a crystal blue, clear sky miss the World Trade Center and crash into it? Um, well, when the second plane hit, the answer was easy: run or
Hmm.
attack. And then, when we looked at who might be behind it, I thought of bin Laden right away. But I also remembered how when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, you know, smart analyst went on and says this has all the hallmarks of Middle Eastern terrorism, the tactics of Hezbollah, um, and then it turned out to be a couple of army guys from the United States.
Yeah.
So I was being very cautious. But Peter said, well, how do you figure out who's behind this? And I said, you go down a list of who has the intent and then who has the capability. And then you narrow the list down to there's plenty of people with the intent. There's a few people with the capability who has both. And then, you end up with Saddam Hussein, you end up with Iran, you end up with bin Laden. And Peter Jennings, who operated with near perfection without a script during the most unpredictable and overwhelming story that any of us would ever cover, said, when did you interview bin Laden? I said, 3 years ago. He yelled to somebody, get me the transcript of that interview. And with a highlighter, he marked off like 4 spots in the 7 pages. It must have taken him all of 30 seconds. And he said, pull these sound bites. And when he played those later that day, as it became apparent that Al Qaeda was behind 9/11, you would have thought that that interview was done on September 10th, 2001,
Mm.
because he said, we're declaring war. This will be greater than our war with the Russians. You may not understand it, but you will come to understand it when you're dragging the bodies of the dead in boxes and coffins in your shameful defeat. It was a stunningly predictive interview.
And is that what got you into the work of counterterrorism and counterintelligence? Or how does that transition happen? Because you're beyond public information at that point.
Yeah, so indirectly, what happened is Bill Bratton, who he and I remain good friends. Now we're both back in the private sector. I in the press, and he in the consulting business. And he called up, kind of after the dust settled after 9/11 and said, we got to get back in the game. This is not the time to be on the sidelines. We have things we can bring to this. And I was covering the Washington, D.C. sniper, and he called and said, I'm being named police chief of Los Angeles. I'm being sworn in on Monday. Can you come out for the swearing in? And I came out and, got in the car with him after the ceremony, and we were riding towards headquarters, going to have lunch or something. And he said, can you come on board? And, at that point, I was the anchor man of 2020 with Barbara Walters, and doing very well in journalism and television. And I said, well, I kind of did that job already, because I had a little bit of a rule of, don't do the same job twice. It should be something different, something more challenging. And he said, I don't want you for public information. I want you to be head of counterterrorism. And I thought, well, that's different. And I said, how's that going to go over in the LAPD? I'm not from LA. Come out of the Marine Corps. And, that's going to be a little bumpy. And, Bratton is a real visionary. And I don't say was, I say is, because he's still like this today. But he said, I have 9,200 cops who know all about the LAPD. I'll find you one, and I'll partner you up with a ranking officer who can, organize the LAPD part of this. But I don't have anybody who sat in a cave with Osama bin Laden, who has been to Afghanistan and Pakistan, who has met with, defectors from Al Qaeda, who has studied their organization and their plots and their plans. I don't have one of those. So my vision is you too will build us a counterterrorism bureau. You on the intel side, him on the policing side, and I need you to create something to make this city safe from terrorism. And he gave me a brilliant commander, Mark Leap, and together we put it together. And Bratton took some flack for it, I have to say, and so did I. But it was worth it. what we put together is something that protected the city in many ways from a lot of plots and potential attacks.
What do you think uh, prepared you for that? Obviously, Bratton saw the ability in you based on the reporting work that you did. But again, I come back to that's a cop's job, right? That is not a reporter who's playing cop at night. You're taking on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, the LAPD, later the NYPD. How do you learn that skill set, or is it really not that much different than the work you were doing as a reporter?
Well, intelligence and reporting is really the same thing. Reporters bristle at that, but don't worry, so do intelligence people. But I mean, think of the core principles. Intelligence is getting the right information and understanding a problem, getting it first if you can, and then getting it to the people who need it most. In reporting, it's everybody. In intelligence, it's, policymakers or operators. And then telling them not just here's the raw data, but adding the analysis, which is here's what it means, and here's what it could mean, and here are the dependencies and the codependencies and the things that could affect the problem. Because intelligence is really, at its simplest, understanding a problem, and analysis is understanding it well enough to do something about it. Well, the similarities between that and journalism are almost seamless, except one side needs to tell everybody and the other side needs to keep it secret. But the processes are extraordinarily similar. The tools are different. And it was about understanding the problem in Los Angeles, understanding the adversary, the terrorists, having those insights into how to keep that information fresh, and creating those new relationships with the FBI, the CIA, a brand new agency called Homeland Security. We were building it as we were flying, but I had spent enough time covering it to know a lot about it. I'd kind of gotten deeper into it to know a little bit more about it, and spent enough time in policing in the NYPD for that brief period on a large scale, but enough time around it as a reporter to understand how the levers of a police department work. Um, and, I had a great partner with that commander, Captain Gary Williams, the whole team in LA. And, their strengths accounted for my weaknesses, and my knowledge accounted for things that they didn't know, but we would learn together. And that's how that worked. And when we ended up going back to the NYPD, that's how it worked again.
I know there's a question in the audience about the Boston Marathon bombing. Just before we get to the specific question, where were you in your career progression at that point? Do you remember?
Yeah. So I had left the FBI after the LAPD had went to the FBI. I left the FBI and was working at CBS News, and the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and I was on the way to the airport with my wife, plane tickets in hand. The kids were all taken care of here, and the bombing happened, and I said, should we go back? She said, we're on vacation. Just get on the plane. And I said, if there's a bombing in Boston, there could be a bombing in New York and then another in LA. And, the kids are here. There could be mayhem. And she said, all right, all right, all right. I see where this is going. Turn around. And then I spent the rest of the time covering that bombing.
Bruce, did you want to ask a question?
I did. Thank you, Mr. Miller. You've had a fascinating career. Do you have any unanswered questions about the Boston Marathon bombing? Because I do.
Um, Not really. I mean, we kind of know the whodunit part
Mm.
with the brothers. There was a controversy afterwards about how much did the FBI know? How much should they have known? Did they follow up on that? Did they share it with the Boston police? Did they share it with the police in the town where the bombers lived, even though they had been running leads on them as, that came from Russian intelligence people saying they might be terrorists. And, you know, most of that has been gone through, and most of those answers are out there. But I feel, Bruce, that there's something you're thinking about. What is it?
Well, there's a couple of things. So first of all, William Weinreb, who is the prosecutor, the chief federal prosecutor, he said in pre-trial, and I was sitting there in court when he said it, and later asked him about it. He said the brothers didn't have the skills or the equipment to build the bombs. And I always thought, well, that's interesting. So if they didn't, then who did? He said they must have had help. And the defense never picked up on that. I asked him about it years later, and he said, no matter how much we've researched, and it was the most investigative report things that we've ever done and turned over every stone, there are some questions we'll never have answers to. And I thought, that can't be, because if there's somebody out there who's building bombs, terrorists, you'd want to find him or them.
Well,
it was a curious lack of curiosity.
So the bombs that they built, as you recall, were largely built from black powder harvested from commercial grade fireworks that they purchased, you know, kind of going up and down 95 or
Right.
Pennsylvania, I think it was.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Thank you. Sorry, Pennsylvania. And you know, this is not highly sophisticated. There was TATP initiators, if I recall, which is a little bit sophisticated, but it was very much in vogue in terrorist circles overseas. So starting off with, I don't know the answer to the question. If you look at future bombings like the attempted multiple backpack bombings of the New York City subways that were to be carried out by Najibullah Zazi a couple of years later, you know, he had gone online. He had gotten instructions and recipes. He had gone to Afghanistan and back, which these guys I don't think had. But the ability to send these instructions online, the ability to find them in Inspire magazine, the famous article, How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom, offered a lot of these skills. So I don't think we...
Yeah, the pyrotechnics they got, according to the American Pyrotechnic, and I don't want to get into a controversy, I just want to raise the issue. The American Pyrotechnic Association still to this day has on their line a response which they issued the next few days after the bombing and saying you couldn't make bombs out of this black powder. It wasn't really physically possible, especially given the amount. But let me ask you, you had a unique interview with Rick Donahue, who was shot in Watertown during the shootout.
Yeah.
And he said to you that he and Sean Collier, who had been the policeman who had been murdered at MIT, had a very close relationship. So they were inseparable, and we used to see each other every weekend. And I thought that was really curious because Collier couldn't have seen him every weekend. He was on the MIT outing club, and there's pictures of him being out every weekend. How did he see Collier? And wasn't it a weird coincidence that Collier was at the MIT scene soon after Collier was murdered, and then all of a sudden winds up in Watertown? We've never had an answer how he even got to Watertown, and his partner that night, Lucas Keto, never was asked about it.
So Bruce, it sounds like we might need to put you in charge of counterterrorism and counterintelligence here because you're onto stuff. But
I am so onto stuff.
But John, let me take that. You can certainly answer that question, but let me also ask you this: to I think a broader point Bruce is raising is you're now a journalism. You're back in journalism. You're working for CNN. Once a cop, always a cop. I'm sure there are things you heard and saw you can't tell us about that probably keep you awake at night if you let it. How do you reconcile all the things maybe you didn't get to solve, you didn't get to the bottom of, Does that stuff you think about, or is that stuff you just got to kind of let go?
No, it's stuff you think about. It's stuff that, haunts my memory. The way these questions, live in Bruce's, which is we, and when I say we, I mean reporters, but I also mean detectives. We don't like loose ends. We don't like unanswered questions because our quest, no matter which side of the tape we're working on, is to get the questions answered, and all of them. So, you know, uh, I look at things that still date back to 9/11, and if you've seen the revelations coming out of, some of the family lawsuits, um, regarding, connections with the Saudi government and individuals on the ground and things that are just being revealed for the first time. As a guy who wrote the book on 9/11, before the 9/11 Commission report came out, which had more than my book, because they had subpoena power, and then who read the weapons of mass destruction report, you're like, we didn't know these answers. We hadn't seen these tapes. And remember, during some of these times, I was in and out of the agencies where those answers lived, or at least the questions lived, and some of the material lived. So you never let go of that stuff. I got questions right now that I still need to get answered. And, if I didn't do them as a federal official, I'm going to try to do them as a reporter.
Hmm. Let me, I know running up against time. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm going to ask you a compound question that are in two opposite directions, but let's bring it to the current. Adam has put in the chat one of them, which is, what advice do you have to young journalists? The other that I wanted to ask you, and I mentioned this before we started recording, which is, we were hoping we were gonna get you here today, unless there was a mass shooting in America, and unfortunately, there was. Um, why is this night different than all other nights, as we say in the tradition of Judaism? But at the same time, I ask you about what advice do you have to young reporters. I wonder, what advice do you have to all of us with respect to um, where we're at in this moment of mass shooting, of ramped up rhetoric, the role of a free press, the role of a late night comedian. I know I'm mixing issues here, but in the interest of getting you back to Anderson Cooper on time, what do you make of it all?
Allan, could we get back to Bruce? That's way too hard. All right. So,
Touche. Fair enough.
uh, taking them on in order, and they do mix together.
Yep.
My advice for young journalists is, my story couldn't happen again, I don't think, because people say, well, how did you get started? And when I tell them, they're like, yeah, that's not going to work for me. Those circumstances are unlikely, to meet in that perfect storm. And I get that. But my real advice is, what I did was I found opportunity, and I had a combination of drive and luck. And I don't underestimate the role of luck. And I'd had a leg up from my dad who taught me things about how to do things. Um, but now, the democratization of journalism, both a blessing and a curse. Let's focus on the blessing because we're coming right up on the curse. The blessing is, you don't have to get a job at NBC or CBS or ABC or the Daily News or the New York Times or the Boston Globe. There is YouTube, there is Instagram, there is, social media channels, Substack, Bulwark, you name it, where you can hone your craft, prove yourself, um, uh, run, a journalistic exhibition game on all kinds of channels that when I was a kid just didn't exist. Um, you know, uh, what they say, don't pick a fight with people who buy ink by the barrel. Well, right now, the people who buy ink by the barrel, are on their way out. And, people who deal in ones and zeros, are on the way up. Think of entrepreneurs. You pick your own, Barry Weiss, somebody who starts a blog that turns into a newsletter, that turns into an online publication, that turns into something that somebody's talking about buying for $100 million. So opportunity abounds. My advice to young journalists is don't wait for someone to come up and hand you one. If you can't get the one you're looking for, make one. The second piece of that question was, don't let anybody tell you can't. You know what they told me? You can't work here. You're 14. There's child labor laws. Well, we figured that out. They said, you can't go on the air. You know, that's for veteran reporters. Well, guess what? They screwed that up, and I saw my opportunity and I took it. And they said, you can't start in New York. You have to go out to, you know, someplace far away and work your way back through the well, guess what? I didn't. You can't do this without getting a college degree. No one will hire you. Well, guess what? Don't let anybody tell you can't. That wasn't all luck. A lot of that was determination. So with the level of opportunity that exists today and your determination, you should be able to make it. And you should be able to make it in a large number of ways, which then translates to the curse. The same democratization of journalism and communications in general gets to the third leg of the question you asked, which is, do we have a greater responsibility? And the answer is we do. In the days of, you know, the one newspaper town or the three newspaper city, and the three TV network universe, all we had to do was say, well, here's what the rumors say. Now let's see what's in the papers. And that was something that we generally thought, well, this is the arbiter of probably something close to the truth. Today, the same democratized media is the place of all rumors, all conspiracy theories, all violent rhetoric, all the things people are talking today about what leads to the active shooter of the day, which is something that we couldn't have conceived of. You know, it's a snowball that started rolling with Columbine and has never stopped. So our responsibility is greater because it's about more than just covering the news. We have to ask ourselves every day, with what's out there, how are we covering the news? Are we covering the news with the right pitch and tone? Not the right opinion, but are we down the middle? Are we covering the news responsibly by deciding, you know, what stories do we pick up from that ether? The most sensational thing that's on the internet today, or something we can carefully vet or ask ourselves, is this something that we really need to be talking about? The widening of the pool of people with voices that can reach millions, and the changing of the rhetoric has given us an awesome responsibility that we are still trying to get a grip on, trying to get our heads around, which is our job just to give the information? Do we have to think about it more or harder? And you know, we have discussions that we had today, which is, okay, let's get the shooter's ID. Now, do we name the shooter? Or are we just telling the next shooter that's how you get famous? And if we do name the shooter, do we name him once and say, here's his background, and then just go back to calling him the shooter? Or we don't do it at all? When the guy has the manifesto, do we print the manifesto because that goes to motive? Or are we saying, now we're being used? This is part of the end game, and we are part of the payoff. I don't know the answers to all these questions, but I know we have to be asking them now because we're more than passive bystanders. Somehow we're a part of all this, whether it's the political discourse or the descriptions of violence or the rest of it. Journalism is now going to have to not just be about storytelling, but on the leadership side, it's got to be on the thinking of what we do and how we do it. And like Margaret Mead said, you know, what you study, you change. We are starting to realize that what we cover, we also change, and sometimes in unintended ways. So food for thought. I'll leave it there. And,
Thank you.
And you know, thank you very much, Allan, for the time and and for the walk down memory lane.
Well, no, the pleasure is ours. You know, you said it very humbly, but I think you're right. The career you've had and the experience you bring is unlike any other. And so for you to have spent the last hour with us sharing that is something we're extraordinarily grateful for. And we're also grateful, I would say, that as the journalism community and society wrestles with the kinds of questions you've asked, I think we're very lucky to have somebody like you, at least in the fray, being part of the conversation. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And remember, it's still a business. So I need you to all close your computers and run and watch Anderson Cooper right now. We need the business.
Very good. We'll do. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Just kidding. Appreciate it.
I'm going to do it either way, but thank you.
You got it.
Talk to you soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Bye-bye.
Be well.